Hello, Internet. This is a new experiment I'm trying called Mental Model Mondays. The basic idea is that every Monday I'm going to dive into my personal brain here and share with you guys something that I use to think about things, or a process I have, or a mental model that I have. And recently I've been getting a lot of questions about how I learn things, how do you learn things in context. And so I thought I'd share a little bit of what my process is to learn things, to learn skills, to learn facts, to learn new ways of being. So the model I like to think about when learning things is a model from nature. It doesn't have a name. I call it the 3x3 learning model. And the basic idea is that there are three stages of learning: surface learning, deep learning, and transfer learning. And then there are three inputs that you need in order to learn at each of those stages. You need the skill at that stage, you need the will at that stage, which is sort of like your dispositions and things like the growth mindset, and then you need the thrill, which is your motivation and your prizes and the internal feelings you get from learning the thing. What I'm going to do is share with you my learning algorithm. And so, and again, it's based on that 3x3 learning model. So the first thing I do when I'm learning something is I don't just learn in a vacuum. I found this to be really, really important. I've tried to learn in a vacuum before. Well, I want this skill, so I'm just going to learn the skill. And that doesn't seem to work. Instead, you need a context for your learning. So typically, what I like is project-based learning. I like to use projects to do it. So for instance, right now I'm really focused on leadership, and I am the leader of a company. So I can go in, I can learn something on Sunday, and I can go in and use it in a meeting on Monday. You could also use things like problem-based learning, which is similar to project-based learning, but instead of I want to focus on this solution, you're going to say I want to solve this problem. You can also do overlearning, and this I do sometimes too when there's a skill that seems really useful, but maybe it doesn't apply to a specific project, but it's more of a general life skill where you can actually just say, I'm going to focus on this skill for 30 days and apply it to every single thing I do. And so you can do something like a 30-day challenge. I did a 30-day challenge around learning to use expected value in my decisions. And so I would just, every decision I would make, I would calculate the expected value before I did it. And that gave me a context for this thing, expected value, that I was trying to learn. So it's very important before you even get started with learning, you have to have a context for that. And that's going to help with every single stage, from the surface to the deep to the transfer. It's going to help at every single stage, as well as with your skill, your will, and your thrill, all three of those. So I highly recommend you learn in context. The next thing I'll do is I will find resources to help me learn. I often use something I call the 3-book technique to find resources. And this isn't specifically for books. I just find it easier to remember when I call it the 3-book technique. What it is a way to find the different resources that you will need for that surface, deep, and transfer learning. What I recommend is you find one source. It could be a book or something else that is a why book. It's the mindset book. It shows the psychology behind what you're learning. I also recommend that you get a how resource. This is a step-by-step. Here's the actions to take. And I finally recommend that you get a what book. This is more of a reference tome that you can get to when you're stuck. And I don't recommend you go and you read through everything all at once. What I recommend is you use these resources as you're learning. As you run into issues, you go back to the specific part of the resources that are helpful for you. You have to remember that a lot of what you're going to be learning here is going to be happen through osmosis, through cultural transmission, through talking to people and learning things. And this is something that I learned at a recent workshop I went to, and I really want to work into my learning process. So that means going to conferences and meeting people, and then ingratiating yourself into groups, and really starting to get the group transmission. It also means finding mentors so they can take this tangled mess in your head and really tell you how to organize. Finally, you can sort of a halfway to mentors is skill modeling, where you go, you find somebody who's done this before, you find a bunch of people who have done this before, and you look at them and you say, what is it that they're doing? And we'll talk about that a little more in a second, but it can be helpful for finding learning resources. You might not know exactly what it is you need to learn, but if you do some skill modeling, you look at people and you say, what are their commonalities? Maybe you even talk to them, you interview them, and you say, what would you teach somebody if they only had 3 months to learn this? Walk me through your thought process as you do this. You can start to find resources that teach the skills that matter and not just what has always been taught. Then you're going to actually start going through these resources, learning, applying them to what you're doing. And for me, at this point, in order to move on to the next stage, I find it's really important to capture what I learned. So as I'm going through and I'm learning these things, I'm using these resources, and I'm applying them to what I learn, I make sure to keep in mind the 4 principles of deep learning. So I'm not just looking and saying, hey, what's important, what's not important. That's a really not useful way to do deep learning. That's a good way for surface learning, what's important, what's not important. That's a very surface way of thinking. But in deep learning, it's really about making connections. So there are really 4 types of connections you can make with deep learning. First, you can think about elaboration. Elaboration is how what you're learning is similar to things you have learned in the past. And then you can also do distinctiveness, which is how is this different from other things that I've learned. You can link it to something personal, an anecdote or a frequent thought you've had, something that really means something to you. Even mnemonics, where you're doing it to something that's emotional to you, fit in this category. And you can also do applications. So again, you're learning in context. How does this apply to the context that you're learning or other contexts that you plan to be in the future? Again, there's this cultural transmission aspect, and the question is, how do you capture that? How do you capture that? So there's 2 ways to do that. 2 sort of tools in your toolkit. There's many tools, but 2 I use frequently are, the first one is mirroring. So there are emotional aspects and thought processes of the people that you're going to see who are really good at this that are just hard to quite capture. So one thing you can do is mirror them, mirror their body language, their facial expressions. Just put your body, your voice, your eyes in that same place, and you're going to start to feel what they feel. It's going to put you in the proper emotional context for the thing that you're learning from this group or this mentor. So mirroring is really helpful. And then another thing is thought process modeling, which we talked a little bit about before. And this is where, as they're actually going through the skill, you say, why did you do that? Walk me through your thought process there. How are you doing that? Can you show me that movement you did again? Can you slow down? And by walking through their thought process, you can begin to get the nuances that you wouldn't get from, say, a book. You're capturing these cultural things, but I'm also capturing the actual content of what I learned. So what I'll do is facts I'll put into Anki. So Anki is a flashcard system. I throw things into Anki, and then when I get to practicing steps, it'll have me remember them at the exact right time using something called spaced repetition, which I'll talk about in a second. Also in Anki, I put in any exercises I learn, any things that matter, and I'll talk about how I know what exercises matter in a second. But I actually put things to practice, skills to practice. I will throw an Anki in a separate deck from the facts, and I have a practice time every day where I go through those. Anything interesting that I learn, I throw into Evernote and I tag with the skill. Evernote is a really powerful, searchable database. And whenever I run into a problem and I haven't worked on it in a while, I just search it in Evernote, and I immediately, because I'm always capturing things in Evernote, come up with a bunch of skills. In fact, everything goes into Evernote for me first, and then goes out to Anki or the brain. So that if I don't have time to put something in Anki or the brain right when I learn it, I throw it into Evernote, and then I can go through Evernote and pick the things out that I need. And the brain is the program that we're in now. And what it's really great for is capturing connections between things that I've learned. Again, that's that deep learning principle. Anki captures the surface learning. The brain really captures that deep learning of how things are connected to things in my life, to each other, and how they're different. Once I've captured it, it's time to actually practice the things I learned and the skills and the fact. You got to practice at each level. You've got to practice at the level of surface, which is where you're practicing the facts and you're memorizing and you're rehearsing. You got to practice at the level of deep, which is where you're actually looking at the skills and using the skills and saying, how did they go well? And you got to practice at the level of transfer, which is where you're using things in real life and seeing where they do and don't apply. So one thing to keep in mind here is the triggers that are going off when you're using these skills. Think about, when would I use this skill in the real world? And if you have that practice time like I do, you want to be mentally, visually imagining yourself in those contexts with those triggers, so that when you find yourself in those contexts in real life, you actually have the triggers. Now, if you can actually practice in context with those triggers, even better, but the visualization is a good approximation of that. So ask yourself, why? Why is this skill important? When is this skill important? What should trigger this skill? And that should help you find the triggers. And then you also have to figure out, what exactly is it that I should be practicing? What are the actions that I should take? Mirroring is really helpful here. You can also say, are there people who I know who are good at this? How do I know? And those actions, the actions that let you know people are good at things, are things you definitely want to practice. Ask, if it's a mindset, ask, how would a person with this mindset act? What would they do? Practice those things. What questions would this person ask themselves? This gets you in a thought pattern. Questions are really powerful for getting you in thought patterns, and actually practicing, asking yourself those questions and getting yourself in the thought pattern, either as your practice session or right before you do a skill. Really powerful. You can also ask yourself directly, what are the thought patterns that a person with this mindset would have? And that's a really powerful way to get in as well, where you can actually just get yourself in the same thought loop that the person who actually already has the skill and has trained their mind would have. Another tool I use here for actions is verbal overcompensation. So this is, I use something, every day, or, in the actual context when I'm actually doing this in the real world. I find I'll verbally exaggerate the thought process or mindset to calibrate myself. So I might not actually be able to think that way or do those actions, but by verbally over exaggerating this thought process, it actually goes back into my brain and says, okay, this is actually what you have to learn. At this point, you're doing deliberate practice. You are every day sitting down saying, here's what I need to work on, working on the skill, and immediately afterwards giving yourself feedback. What went well? What could have done better? You could even do structured reflection, which we'll talk about in a second when we get to gaining context. You're also interleaving your practice. What I mean by that is you don't want to spend an hour practicing one skill in front of the mirror, because your brain then does not learn to load the skill into your mind when it needs it. Remember this trigger thing. You need to know the right triggers. So what instead I recommend, and this is borne out by the research on interleave practice, is one of the most proved phenomena in learning, is that you should switch between different skills frequently. And again, load up that trigger right before you switch between the skills. And this teaches your brain to switch context, to load it up, to know when to use it. This is halfway between the deep learning and the transfer learning. It's a really powerful thing to do, is load the trigger and use interleave practice. Finally, you're using spaced repetition. This is also a very proven phenomena in learning. And the basic idea behind spaced repetition is that you review things when you're at about 50% chance of learning it. So this sounds kind of hard to calculate, but that software I mentioned, Anki, can do this for you. So I would do this for skills. Again, I have a skill deck in Anki, and for facts, I have a fact deck in Anki. And usually I have facts as well as processes. If I want to remember processes, I create images of the processes. I use something called the image occlusion extension in Anki to remember it. And then I used this spaced repetition software to review it. Once you're practicing the skills, you need to bring it back to this idea of transfer learning. How can I use it in other contexts? And you really need to make sure that you do that to cement this skill in as part of who you are. And if you don't do this, then you'll be able to use the skill, but it's kind of like clunky. You're kind of a robot that's doing it. You've got conscious competence, but what this will really do, this step is bring you into unconscious competence. So first thing I do is recommend structured reflection. And structured reflection needs to happen immediately at the end of a project in which you use a skill. Give yourself some what if questions. What if I had slightly tweaked the way that my knee was bending when I did that? What if I had changed my thought process and asked myself a slightly different question? You're going to generate a bunch of these what if questions. You're then going to create a list of if-then implications. These are really hypotheses. So your hypothesis is, if I had tweaked my knee just a little bit to the right, I would have had more power when I was doing that kick in martial arts. You're going to take your what if questions and you're going to create hypotheses about what would have happened. And then for the outcomes that you like for those if-then implications, you need to put that back into your learning system so that when you are reviewing these in the future, you know what you're doing. It really helps you to gain a gears level understanding. When you start thinking about how would things change if I change things, it starts to give you a model of how everything works. And when you're testing that question the very next time, it starts to help you figure out where are your models wrong. Because if I test my knee and I find out, wow, I actually got less power this next time, then I know there's something wrong with my model, and my brain can start to work on that. And when I go through my next structured feedback, I'm going to integrate that knowledge. You need context. If you have a very specific trigger, try and bring that trigger into other places, or try and create new triggers for the same skill to try and broaden the applicability of what you're doing. And the final thing I recommend for this stage is to actually teach what you learned. And that's going to get you the nuances of, oh, okay, I guess that doesn't work in this situation, and really start to cement in what you know, and get it so you can explain it. There's not these fuzzy concepts of, oh yeah, then you do that stuff. Because once you teach, you have to be specific. So that is my learning algorithm. If you want to implement this for yourself, I do not recommend that you take this whole thing and you download the Brain and you download Anki, and then you create a practice time, and pick one thing. Pick one tiny thing that you think can improve your learning and try and implement it for yourself. Okay? A few big ones, if you don't do them, might be learning in context, structured reflection, and deep learning. Those three, if you don't have one of those three, I recommend those three would probably make the biggest gains in your learning. So thanks so much for watching, guys. That was my first Mental Model Monday, and see you soon.